he was one of those people who attended the Battle of Mu'tah, which was a very painful battle in the life of the Prophet ﷺ. He says, again, كنت يتيما في حجر بن رواحة فخرج بي معه إلى مؤتة مردفي على حقيبة رحله. He said that I was an orphan in the care of Abdullah ibn Rawaha, and he took me with him to the Battle of Mu'tah, and he carried me on the pad of his saddle. So he was there and he saw the man who was like his father martyred. Now, if you remember Mu'tah, and this of course connects to Usama ibn Zayd, Mu'tah was when the Romans had killed the messenger of the Messenger ﷺ, and so the Prophet ﷺ sent an expedition out because this was an act of war. Zayd ibn Haritha was the first carrier of the banner, and Zayd ibn Haritha was killed. The Prophet ﷺ was watching it from the minbar, meaning Jibreel ﷺ was telling him what was happening. And the Prophet ﷺ said, Zayd radiallahu ta'ala anhu just fell. Ja'far radiallahu anhu just assumed the banner. And then he said, Ja'far radiallahu ta'ala anhu just fell. Abdullah ibn Rawaha just assumed the banner. And then Abdullah ibn Rawaha, he went deep into the battlefield. Actually, if you go to Mu'tah, and I did a mini documentary, if you go to Yaqeen's channel, I actually went to Mu'tah and I filmed there. If you go to Mu'tah, Zayd's grave and Ja'far's grave are relatively close. Abdullah ibn Rawaha is ahead. And one of the reasons is because he plunged forward, radiallahu ta'ala anhu, before he was killed. And the Prophet ﷺ broke down crying after these three men were martyred. And he said, and Khalid radiallahu ta'ala anhu took the banner, وَهُوَ سَيْفٌ مِّن سُيُوفِ اللَّهِ, and he is a sword from the swords of Allah. So Zayd ibn al-Arqam was there at Mu'tah when Abdullah ibn Rawaha was martyred. So this was a major test in his life, as it was a test for those who, of course, were not there. This hurt Medina quite a bit, right? Usama ibn Zayd was deeply in pain. The children of Ja'far, we take the whole jurisprudence of how to deal with the family of the deceased through how the Prophet ﷺ dealt with the children of the shuhada back in Medina. So this was one major test in his life. The next major test in his life, and it's one of the miracles that is narrated for him, and it's in multiple authentic narrations, from Unaysa, from his daughter, in some of the narrations, that the Prophet ﷺ went to visit Zayd ibn Arqam because Zayd ibn Arqam actually went blind towards the end of the life of the Prophet ﷺ. So the Prophet ﷺ went to visit him. Very painful because Zayd is a young man. So as the Prophet ﷺ went to visit him, he said, أَرَأَيْتَ يَا زَيْدْ إِنْ كَانَتْ عَيْنَاكَ لِمَا بِهِمَا كَيْفَ تَصْنَعُ. Prophet ﷺ said, O Zayd, if your eyes remain this way, meaning if you stay blind for the rest of your life, how are you going to react? If you don't recover your eyesight. Which shows you, as the ulama mentioned, that there are multiple ways that you can comfort, prepare the one who's grieving, and that takes, by the way, like a pastoral touch, right? To know what to say, how to prepare. Prophet ﷺ would make dua for your health, but Prophet ﷺ knew what he was doing when he was talking to individual companions. So he said, what would you do if you were going to be blind for the rest of your life? قَالَ أَصْبِرْ وَاحْتَسِبْ. So Zayd gave the perfect answer. He said, I'll be patient and I'll seek the reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the Prophet ﷺ said, إِن فَعَلْتَ دَخَلْتَ الْجَنَّةِ. If you do so, you will enter paradise. And he said, تَلْقَ اللَّهَ وَلَا ذَنْبَ لَكَ. And you'll meet Allah with no sin on you. Of course, this is taken from multiple ahadith where the Prophet ﷺ mentions, hadith Qudsi, that if I take the two eyes, the eyesight of my servant, and he's patient, then I will reward him with Jannah. So it's the blessing of vision. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserve our eyesight, and may Allah azza wa jal preserve the reward of those who lost their eyesight and were patient. Allahumma ameen. So this is one of those narrations, but it continues, and that is that after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam passed away, رَدَّ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ بَصَرَهُ. Allah azza wa jal actually restored the vision of Zayd radiallahu ta'ala. So Zayd went blind for some time towards the end of the life of the Prophet ﷺ, and then after the Prophet ﷺ passed away, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed him to actually have his sight restored. And the implication is that the one who intends to act in a certain way in trial and tragedy, even if the tragedy is lifted, the reward is still maintained. So he did go through this. And he was someone who went on to become a bastion of knowledge after the Prophet ﷺ passed away. Someone who the other companions referred to in regards to his ilm. There's a narration from Abu al-Minhal. He says, سألت البراء عن الصرف. I asked Bara about currency exchange. And he said, سل زيد ibn Arqam فإنه خير مني وأعلم. Go to Zayd ibn Arqam. He is more knowledgeable than I am and he is better than I am. So he's someone who became an authority in scholarship. He was someone who, when fitna broke out between the companions, he sided firmly with Sayyidina Ali radiallahu ta'ala anhu. So of course, in the fitna, you had, the tribulation that broke out. You had the side of Ali, you had the side of Muawiyah, you had those that kind of, removed themselves from all of it, right? And said they wanted no part to do with Muslims that end up fighting amongst each other. And you had some that don't fall neatly within a category, right? They were kind of, between the ranks in that regard. Zayd is one of those who stood alongside Ali radiallahu ta'ala anhu. He said, because I heard the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam say, Man kuntu mawlahu fa'aliyu mawlahu, that whoever loves me, then, or whoever I am a close friend of, beloved to, then Ali radiallahu ta'ala anhu is also close friend to him. And of course, this is Sunni scholarship, by the way. So this is not something to be taken as like an exaggeration. He is someone who loved Ahlul Bayt and who praised Ahlul Bayt, the family of the Prophet ﷺ, and who narrated many of the virtues of the family of the Prophet ﷺ. Now, if you remember, he narrated the narrations about the virtues of the Ansar. And there's one more hadith I'll mention here, which is in a Tirmidhi, that when Anas ibn Malik radiallahu ta'ala anhu, his family, many of them were killed in the massacre of Al-Harra, which was the massacre of Medina. And he wrote a message, كتب إلى أنس بن مالك يعزيه. He wrote a message to him, consoling him, في من أصيب من أهله وبني عمه يوم الحرة, basically to comfort him with everything that had happened on that day. And he wrote to him and saying, إني أبشرك ببشرى من الله إني سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول, I give you the glad tidings from Allah that I heard the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم say, اللهم اغفر للأنصار, that, oh Allah, forgive the Ansar, وَلِذَرَارِيِّ الْأَنصار, and to the offspring of the Ansar, and to the offspring of their offspring. So may Allah Azza wa Jal forgive all of your offspring. So he was giving him the comfort in the midst of that fitna. So again, when fitna takes place, even of course, we love all of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ and we abhor fitna as a whole, right? But at the end of the day, you see sort of the hearts and the way that these people interacted with the text and what they heard from the Prophet ﷺ directly. So he would narrate. He generally was not someone that fought. He was more a scholar and taught in the masjid. He settled in Kufa in Iraq. And when he got old, because he lived to be very old, when people would come to him and they would ask him for hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, so Ibn Abi Layla, he says, قلت لزيد بن أرقم حدثنا عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. Ibn Abi Layla, a famous scholar, said, I went to Zayd and I said, tell us what you heard from the Prophet ﷺ. قال كبرنا ونسينا والحديث عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم شديد. He said, we've gotten old and sometimes I forget now, and speaking on behalf of the Prophet ﷺ is a severe thing. So at this point, I'm not going to share anymore because I'm at a point where my memory is not what it used to be. And so he died a quiet death, radiallahu ta'ala anhu, in Kufa. Some say that it was right before the murder of Al-Hussein, the martyrdom of Al-Hussein radiallahu ta'ala anhu in Kufa. Some say it was right after it and he was grieved over it. But the point is, he died at that time, radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And of course, the massacre took place in Iraq, and that's where he passed away. And some of his students are of the greatest tabi'een. Ibn Abi Layla, Abu Amr al-Shaybani, Tawus al-Kaysan, Abu Ishaq al-Shaybani, Ata ibn Abi Rabah, the great mufti of Mecca from Africa. All of them learned under him, and they narrated his narrations. And he had over 90 hadiths from the Prophet ﷺ. So up to 100 hadiths from the Prophet ﷺ, which is very significant. And those hadith include, again, as I said, some of the ways that we live our lives as Muslims. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be pleased with Zayd, to accept it from him. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be pleased with all of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. May Allah send his peace and blessings upon the Messenger of Allah ﷺ and his family. And may Allah Azza wa Jal include us amongst that legion of people that followed him and gather us with him sallallahu alaihi wasallam and with those noble people at the Hawd. Allahumma ameen. Inshallah ta'ala, we will stop there and we will continue next week. Jazakumullahu khaira. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.